DJ Caruso, I appreciate you joining me to talk about Bronx Zoo 90, which I watched this week, and there is a lot in here to unpack. I think, very importantly, this film does a really great job, this series, of explaining to Yankee fans that sort of having a middling offense and a solid record in Juan Soto in 2024 isn't so bad. You maybe don't need to complain on Twitter every night. Uh, what was the goal of pulling it together and releasing it now? And why were you so inspired by Joel Sherman's story to sort of tackle this project?
Well, it's kind of twofold. During the pandemic, when Joel had written these articles, because there was no live sporting events to kind of go through, I grew up in Connecticut, kind of a Mets fan, like the Yankees, but I'm a diehard Mets fan. But I read the article, and there was two things that jumped out at me. One, I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot about Howie Spira. Oh, I remember Steinbrenner kind of got kicked out of baseball, and I do remember like this Kevin Moss guy that kind of came through and kind of, so it kind of reminded me of things that I remembered back then. And then also the power of the story felt like it sort of paralleled to me the pandemic. Um, you know, as bad as it was and as terrible as the 1990 season was, like without things that didn't fall into place, look what happened to the Yankees and the dynasty that sort of stumbled and came back in. So to me, it was like a look under the hood, a look behind the curtain of what happened in order for this dynasty to kind of get back up on its feet and to be the best franchise in all of sports, forget just baseball, So that was very interesting. And one other thing I'll touch on is it also reminded me of the power of the beat reporter, where that was our only in. Like any story that came out of the Yankees would come from these beat reporters into the paper, covered by Warner Wolf or covered by Len Berman on the news. And that was sort of our world. And ESPN would pick up what these guys were. And so I thought, you could make a whole movie about these young beat reporters and the power that they had. Not the power they had, but also they were the way that Steinbrenner feuded with Winfield and got the message out about Mattingly's contract. It was a very interesting perspective. So all of those elements to me, really seemed to me like it would make a really compelling series.
I would say that especially came through what you're talking about in the section where you're talking to Joel Sherman, and he mentions that there's this Winfield press conference where he's traded to California and he's saying, I'm not, and he's in there and it's mentioned like, well, does anybody have footage of that? And he's like, no, it was just like six of us in a room. Nobody.
I know. Like, think about it. It's guys with pads and paper, right? There's no cameras. There's no anything. But the biggest thing that's happened, like imagine if the Yankees are training Juan Soto and like nobody's there, right?
Yeah. And he's passing. He's saying,
yeah, no, exactly. He comes into the press conference and says, oh, by the way, I'm not going. I mean, to me, to have that on camera would have been gold, right? It would have been magic. But it's so, that wasn't the time, right? It wasn't the time.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking, this was perfect for me. So I grew up a Yankee fan, followed the team pretty religiously my whole life, but that whole life begins in 1990. This is the year I was born, and I grew up, I had a Kevin Moss poster in my childhood bedroom. And as soon as when I had consciousness of it, I asked my parents, like, who is that? Because I watched the Yankees and they had Derek Jeter and Bernie Williams. I didn't know who that was. And it said, basically when you were being born, he was the most, it said baby bomber. So,
that's right.
We were, having a baby, we figured we'd buy that. So this is a way in for me too. The 1990 season is meaningful to me. I've always felt a kinship with that Reds championship team, but I don't know much about the 90 Yankees. But fans of my generation, and especially the younger generation, one past me, there's this feeling of George Steinbrenner being so venerated and being like, we grew up with the Dynasty, or we grew up just past the Dynasty, when people are mourning his death and saying, you hear the sports radio callers today saying, we wish we had George back. Were you sort of, I don't know if concerned is the right word, but when you were making the series, were you thinking a little bit about pricking a hole in that reputation and opening that information to a generation of fans that all they know is, man, why don't we spend like the old days? Why don't we bring the 90s?
Well, I think it's twofold, because in doing this, like when you kind of dive in, like I really fell in love with George Steinbrenner. Like, even though he made all these mistakes and did all these things, like he was such a fascinating character, right? And so I think that you probably, now being born in the 90s, you kind of might remember the Steinbrenner who rehabilitated his image, who was on Seinfeld, who was sort of doing his thing, was on Saturday Night Live hosting and doing. So he sort of rehabilitated himself. But I think the one thing about George is he's that side of us that's all passion. Like knee-jerk decisions. A cab driver will tell him something and he's like, great, I'm getting rid of that guy. I hate that outfielder, right? It's like he's that part of us that's impulsive. Like, we just want to be impulsive. And George didn't have any control on that impulse. Like, he would always want to do something that would make them win now. I didn't think it's interesting to me because I think being older, I always knew that there was that side of George. Like, there's that side of George where, and again, Yankee fans, like, you even see it in the documentary, like, they can't wait to get rid of him, and then they can't wait to get him back, like in less than 6 months, right? And so that's George. He's polarizing. There is no gray area on George Steinbrenner, right? So I think he made a lot of mistakes. I think he let that bitterness and that Winfield contract, we talk about that was signed in 1980, fester for 10 years. Never once in my research did they ever really sit down man to man until the end and try to hash that out when the lawsuits got big. And so I wasn't worried about tarnishing George Steinbrenner. I think it was important to show that he's that impulsive person. And as far as baseball goes, Gene Michael is the complete opposite, right? He's going to be logical. He's going to talk about, on base percentage before anyone was going to think about it. So to answer your question, I wasn't worried about it because I knew that enough New York Yankee fans would know that everything George did wasn't always on the up and up. But one thing George always wanted to do was win. He just wanted to win. And sometimes at all costs. And at all cost isn't necessarily mean you're doing the right thing.
And that ties right into my next thought of, I think the same fans who, weren't around for this period would be stunned by that footage you mentioned of that massive ovation at the stadium when his suspension was originally announced. And I mean, obviously, eventually there is a turn back, but in some, there's a lot of different factors are responsible for the dynasty that rises. And
yes,
a lot of it is him being away and handing the reins to Stick Michael. But I wonder if that moment almost fuels that impulsiveness too that you mentioned when he sees the fans up in arms. I wonder if that changes his tone, makes him realize that the next person to take the reins has to be a little bit different and has to give these fans in the city what he also believes they deserve. It almost feels like Seth Meyers at the correspondence dinner, like poking the bear. I don't know. Right, that's what it felt like to me watching.
Well, I think that's an interesting observation because I do know like when that moment was really touching for me because when Susan talks about it, like she gets emotional, like, because, he as flawed as he was, he loved this team so much and he thought the fans loved him. Right. And they did, there's this love hate, but at the end of the day, it's like, it's kind of a heartbreaking moment. I do think that I'd like to think, obviously can't be in his head, that definitely affected him in a way where he realized, like, when your ego is up here and you're all over the papers and you're doing this and you're on the Olympic committee and he's the first celebrity owner I've ever came across or would know. Like, he literally was, everyone knew George Steinbrenner before you knew who was playing second base sometimes, right? You knew George Steinbrenner. I can't help but think, but that was a sword and pierced his heart when he saw them people, that standing ovation for him being banned from the game and the team that he loves so much. And he probably, hopefully, had some introspective thoughts and sort of said, yeah, I'll hand this to Gene. It's going to stay calm. He'll keep it going. And then there's also the question of, which we didn't really dive into deeply, was he always on the phone? Was he still involved? Was he not? You know what I mean? It's just, I can't imagine George just went on vacation, right?
Yeah, although the SNL episode was good. So
yes, it was. It was very good. It was very good. Yeah,
he did get some business done.
Yeah.
Well, in telling this story, you do get a lot of participation, obviously from the scribes and from Susan, but a lot of former players also speak on their experience this season. And Bernie Williams joins in 91, Dave LaPointe and is narrating. Were you surprised at how much participation you got from former players and how much they were willing to speak about that went wrong that year?
I was pleasantly surprised just because I realized, I think, again, in retrospect, this is a part of Yankee history that, the Yes Network isn't going to be highlighting, right? It's like you can't really find it. So it's sort of like this like blip in Yankee history that's sort of like, wait, it's gone. Like, what sort of happened? And, when your owner gets kicked out of baseball, it's not something that you're going to be proud of as a franchise, right? And all the history. So I was happy to see that people wanted to talk about it because I think particularly like see a Bernie who was in the minor league system, who knew Gene, There was a great story that didn't really make it in there, the documentary, but George really wanted to trade Bernie.
Mhm.
Like he was kind of a valuable asset, and George didn't know what position he was going to play. And Gene Michael would say, "Oh yeah, I called every club, and nobody talked about Bernie because Gene never mentioned Bernie when he talked to every club, but he can at least tell George he called everybody." And so Bernie was around in that 89, 90. He was kind of feeling it almost. I think he got a taste in 1990 of a bat or two or something. I can't recall. So it was nice to have it. But they all really wanted to talk. And most interestingly enough, is every single ex-player and even some of the old executives we interviewed was like, they refer to him as Mr. Steinbrenner. It's not George. It's Mr. Steinbrenner, right? And it just kind of shows you the reverence they have still for him, even though at the time they might have been feuding with him or doing something. There's like this reverence they have for George.
Yeah, I was touched by a lot of things, and I think one of the things that's maybe there are plenty of emotional bites. There's also the Buck Showalter bites when you speak to him. What jumped out at me is, several franchises later, 35 years, like he did not find the losing very funny. Even revisiting it, like you have people like Dave LaPointe being like, Andy Hawkins no hitter, man, like, oh, and Jesse
Yeah.
Barker, oh, that was embarrassing. And Buck Showalter's like, yeah, I don't remember it. It was terrible.
Yeah, I don't want to recall.
How tough was it maybe to convince him to play along? And were you surprised to still see him being basically unable to get over these indignations of 1990?
No, because I think that's Buck. And I think, I think the one, again, the interesting thing about Buck is even after you fast forward into Mattingly's last game in Seattle and this whole thing, and when Steinbrenner basically fired him without firing him, basically said, you can come back, but nobody on your staff can come back because Steinbrenner was, and then realizing that Steinbrenner wanted to bring Buck back, he fired him and went to his house, but Buck had already got a job with the Arizona. And so like that Buck missed out, like Joe Torre was the right person. You know what I mean? Obviously Joe's Joe, but it's like Buck just missed out on that. So I think Buck, the losing and being part of the culture change and then not quite cashing in, I still think that hurts Buck, right? I think that hurts Buck a lot. But yeah, he's just great. I mean, even he's just so brutally honest. Even like when the Dion Bose game, he was just like, we hadn't scored a run in a month. I didn't care. I'm sending him like, I don't care. So yeah, Buck's dry sense of humor is really interesting. But the great stories that if I could just, from a baseball guy, Buck telling these great stories about being with Billy Martin in the minors and everything he learned. And before Billy had his 2 drinks, the baseball knowledge that he would get. But then after the 2 drinks, you got to carry him home and make sure he gets home alive. And all this crazy stuff. Like there's so many great tangents, Yankee tangents you can go off on here to really get into it.
Yeah, that was basically my exact next point of, the names that are missing for various reasons. I mean, Billy Martin is one that really lingers, obviously. I mean, we know why Billy Martin is not in this, and you do a great job of trying to incorporate his voice and beginning the series with him. But I think a lot of us probably didn't know how closely Buck and Billy were intertwined, because we think of Buck as the veteran, we don't think of Buck as the kid. How important was it to weave his influence into this documentary? And were there any other names where you were sort of like, I'm not sure how to get them in, and I know I can't get them to participate, but I want them to feel included?
Yeah. The big one for me who turned us down just didn't want to go there. Like, it was great. First of all, it was important to get Buck's influence in there because Buck really was sort of the change of the culture, right? To me, he was literally the change of the culture. Like Stump was kind of like a Band-Aid. And then Buck had to come in and like, okay, we have permission to change the culture. And he did change the culture. Like we're going to be bunting all day in spring training and like all this stuff that's not sexy, right? Baseball, baseball, baseball. So that was important. I really wanted to talk to Winfield.
Yeah.
He just won't talk about it. He gave us a quote. He just doesn't want to go there. And I think obviously there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of things, he had pretty damn good statistics over those 10 years, right? If you look at the statistics, but there's just bitterness there. And rightly so, you know what I mean? It's like but I would have loved to hear a little more from his perspective and his agent, but like how he does have a check for 15,000 if I want, whatever, you know what I mean? It's like, so going back and trying to answer questions. Maybe he lent Howie money. Maybe it had nothing to do with gambling, but it could open a can of worms for Dave. So I think Dave just didn't want to go there, right? And then Dion, I really wanted to get Dion's perspective. But Dion was going to interview with us, but that was a time right in the middle of when we were shooting is when he had that foot surgery and like they had to do something with his toe. And so then it never came back. And, I think Dion would be more excited to talk about his time with the Braves than he would be talk about his time with the Yankees,
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the two I really wanted to, but couldn't quite get them.
Yeah, but they definitely, I mean, you would be hard pressed to say that they don't feel present.
No, they're very present, but it faced a talk, but they're super present because they were so prevalent in that year and really important. And Dion coming in when Dave came out and all those things. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. You obviously, there are a couple controversial figures that you do get to speak with and try to figure out a way to finesse their stories into this piece. Howie Spira obviously takes center stage for quite a while. How did you settle on the strategy you employed to present his story? And when you sit down with him, how do you, I mean, man, I know this is sort of deep, but how do you really parse fact from fiction? You mentioned you have that, he's got the check, he's got the proof. How do you sell him properly?
Well, I think you really have to listen to what Howie's saying, and then you really have to comb through it, which we did, to figure out like where can we find the truth? Like, like it could be, and even one of the people who did a real long article on Howie years ago just said, like, it's 80% bullshit and it's 20%, hey, there's some truth in there, right? So you have to decipher where the truth lies and what happens in certain things. So it was let Howie talk, and Howie loves to talk once we found him and go through his thing, and then really going through it and, like the specificity of certain things, like, well, if Winfield's foundation was corrupt, like, what exactly is the corruption? Like, what do you remember exactly? And no, I don't really remember, but I know he was embezzling money and like, you know what I mean? There's not like those specifics. So you have to go, okay, wait, this doesn't seem right. So it's really like letting Howie do his thing and then kind of going back and doing our homework and going through what he said and kind of parsing it out. So, yeah, he's quite the character. I don't think he's changed one bit in 30, 40 years.
Yeah, that you want to talk about something that comes through is that both the eccentricity and the fact that he sort of believes a lot of conclusions are posited in this, series, and a lot of people are given credit for the dynasty. He takes full credit for the Yankees dynasty, which is sort of
he does. I did more for the Yankees than anyone ever picked up a baseball bat.
That is the all-timer of just like, yeah, let Howie cook. Like, okay, great. And I know you have a lot of threads that you're trying to weave, and that's sort of one where you're like, hey, I'll let him say it. Whatever. It's up to him.
Exactly. That's gold, right? That's gold. That's documentary gold right there, right?
Yeah. You don't have to believe it. You can a little bit. Just allow him to say it.
But the thing is, he does believe it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. That comes through as well. The Mel Hall interview too, of course. I mean, that's someone who I think I can't imagine. I never expected to hear from him on any of these topics. And he is, very open on the, that public facing stuff that in the early 90s, it's obviously taboo, but also tolerated by plenty of people. So, how did you go about securing that interview, and how did you make sure that narrative was presented the way that you presented it?
Well, it was reaching out to Mel and Joel and a few reporters have tried over the years and haven't had success. And, my in was like, look, I want to talk about the 1990 Yankees and your time at the Yankees and things that happened there. And he agreed. Like, he finally agreed. It took a bunch of prison letters. Like, you have to reach out, like, prisoner number. And interestingly enough, no one in that prison knows that he played for the New York Yankees, right? He's just Mel Hall, right? He's just Melvin Hall Jr., right? And so he's in there. So I didn't know what to expect from Mel. I didn't, as you can tell from the documentary, it's not like this super tabloid journalist guy going in there saying, well, you did this and you did this. He's like, I just wanted to hear him as a human being talk and talk about baseball. When you rip the door off the hinges, when Stump got mad, talk about Chaz. Like, how did this all happen? This is what, and sort of just see what happens and kind of let it flow. So it was a very interesting interview. It's not what I expected. I expected maybe a little bit of remorse and things, and it just doesn't seem like, even after all this time, that he's there yet, or he's willing to show any of that, or, because like anyone else in there, he still thinks he's getting out and that he was a victim of a sentence, right?
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, for anybody who's unfamiliar watching this, will certainly open your eyes to some stuff that was going on in 1990 beyond even the typical off-field shenanigans.
Right.
Pascal Perez of it all.
Yeah.
Does seem like Steinbrenner ripped his shoulder apart, though, doesn't it? Like that does.
Well, it seems like forcing him to throw the bullpen. I mean, I'm sure Pasquale was not a guy who was like doing his arm care work and stuff down in the Dominican Republic, but yeah, I mean, that was just at a time when the Yankees, I think coming out of '89, they actually were pretty good with the bat.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? They actually had a pretty decent offense. They didn't have any pitching, and so the one thing everyone was like, we need to get pitching. And to kind of like realize that all these other free agents went up to Toronto and didn't sign with the Yankees. They didn't want to be the Winfield thing really hurt Steinbrenner as far as free agency go. Cause like people are like, why do I want to come there and be subject to this? But let's use him to get my quote up. And then I'll go sign with Toronto and I'll go sign with Houston or wherever it would be. And so, yeah, I think all that stuff sort of led the Yankees to have to sign Pasquale out of desperation. And it's sort of a fitting beginning to the 1990 season, him not showing up to spring training and the whole thing. And George, when he finally does, putting on the show, have him throw 100 pitches at night, bring all the reporters out to show your prize signee. And then him never, I think he made 3 starts or 4 starts that year.
Yeah. Numbers are okay, but they're barely there.
Yeah.
I not to dwell on Kevin Moss as well before we go, but I do think that's interesting, and I was happy to see him because I don't think that's a career that most of us would really pinpoint as having a major role in the turning of the franchise and the plans moving forward. Because a lot of us know, okay, that was the best player on the terrible 1990 and 1991 teams. Like, why is he any more important than Lee Guterman? But Bernie in the documentary does mention Moss's emergence as a turning point and a realization that the front office had of, okay, there is something in the minors. We need to stop turning these guys into veterans. We need to figure out what we really have down there. And it's in episode 1, I think, when you touch on, oh, by the way, Mariano Rivera and Jorge Posada and Andy Pettitte are also here. Like, don't forget that they're here. Before starting production, did you sort of view Moss as that even?
Well, this is the reason I'm smiling is like, as a filmmaker, you have like theses and theories, right? And so I would tell my producers, I said, like, you know what? I think Kevin Moss, significance of Kevin Moss is in this year of all these dire things and trying, here's someone who came through the system and came up, and it let the fans know, and that it let the Yankees know that, we can breathe, if we're patient, we can have players like this and we can breathe the success. And so unprovoked, when I was interviewing Bernie and I mentioned Kevin Moss and Bernie said that, I had the biggest inner smile. I was like, this is like, he's proving my thesis right. And this is Bernie Williams, right? He's proving my thesis right. And so it is true. It's like, because it was always like, who can we sign? Who can we get? How can we do this? How are we going to pay this guy? But from within here comes this sort of guy who captivated for 3 months, who captivated the city, even though the team was in last place, because he was literally hitting home runs at a pace faster than Babe Ruth and doing it on a team that wasn't very good. And, getting on SportsCenter, the one good Yankee bite you would get from there would be Kevin Moss doing something. And so it was really interesting. But yeah, I was so happy that Bernie said that, because it kind of was like a thesis of mine going into this documentary. And when Bernie sort of confirmed that, I was like, oh, great, this is fantastic.
Yeah, the original "This is SportsCenter" ad in there too, basically.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, before those were such a production, you just had Kevin Moss doing a 10-minute shoot. Yeah, I don't know that people are going to be so mad that I wasn't like, what was Don Mattingly like? But I had to talk about the Moss thing. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, and Mattingly, like I always look at Mattingly in the 1990 season as kind of like my Tom Hanks, right?
Yeah.
Like, the guy that you love, he hurt his back and you felt for him, and all this chaos and the zoo that was around him for a guy who's just a baseball player, right? And even then, even George's antics in the media even pushed Don to sort of have to say, okay, if I guess this is what it means being in New York, then like, if you guys don't want me here, then maybe I'm not wanted here. And like, for Don to say that, you can just tell there's not a lot of, it's just like, he just felt like he had to say that because he loved playing for New York and couldn't imagine playing anywhere else.
Yeah. That comes through as well. One more Gene Michael point as well. He obviously gets a lot of credit in the documentary series and across the globe for constructing the Dynasty. but I don't think he gets enough credit in the public eye for building Moneyball, which you point out very clearly. How important was it for you to point that out as well?
Well, it was really important for me to point out because I think I think the Yankee fans, true Yankee fans know Gene Michael, and baseball guys kind of know Gene Michael did this, but I don't think the world knows that like Gene really was that guy, because he was such a quiet guy. So I think for me, it's important to get that out, but also knowing that a guy who was really, into on base percentage before anyone was even talking about on base percentage, and to kind of look at that team and to go through it. And some of the old scouts we talked to who didn't kind of make it into the documentary would just talk about Gene and the system. And when Jeter was in first year of, I guess it was single A ball, I think he made 56 errors. Right. And then Gene went down with him in between, and they sort of kind of worked together. And then the errors, like he was just that kind of guy, like how you approach in the baseball and all the basic things about a guy, by the way, who was a player, who was a coach, who was a general manager, who was a scout. There wasn't anything that Gene Michael didn't do. He was the Yankee, an ultimate Yankee. Ironically, Steinbrenner gets rid of him before the dynasty goes back, but that's just typical George. But no, so it was important for me to show that, and I do think Yankee fans know that, but I do want the world to kind of give Gene a little bit of a nod and to say this was a man way ahead of his time.
Yeah, and shout out to whoever was in charge of the Reds and Astros for taking Phil Nevin and just ignoring Derek Jeter for 5 picks. You guys are the best as well. You guys are just
exactly.
Gene Michael. I'll wrap on this, and I really appreciate you spending so much time with me. In terms of your theses, I guess, what do you hope that New Yorkers and fans and certain younger generations who aren't familiar with the Yankees circus take away from this documentary? And conversely, what do you sort of hope will draw in the older New Yorkers who were there and might be saying, I don't know, I don't want to revisit that chapter?
Well, I think the older New Yorkers who I'll start there. The older New Yorkers who might not want to revisit that chapter, I would say it's too tempting for them not to want to revisit this, to kind of look back. And also, we actually are opening the curtain and looking under the hood more so than anyone's really ever done before. So to kind of understand those inner workings, like for me, like I said, when I started reading Joel's article and kind of remember, oh my gosh, Howie Spira. That's right. I forgot about Howie Spira. Why did George really get kicked out of baseball? Because if you ask people now, he was gambling. Like, no, he wasn't gambling, right? So I think for the narrative, to connect the narrative to what happened, I think the older Yankee fans, and to remember 1990, before social media and before any of this, and it wasn't a digital world, it was an analog world. And I think it's important for that. I think there will be a warm, nostalgic feeling to some of these stories when they see that. And I think for everyone else, I think to me, a New Yorker, like New Yorkers are the best, right? It's like, no matter what, you can knock us down, you can do whatever you want, but we're going to come back up and we're going to come out on the other end. And I think not only did the Yankees do that, I think Chaz did that when you see what a strong woman she's become and all that. So I think there's sort of like, from the Phoenix rises, from the ashes rise of Phoenix, the story's positive. Like it's looking at some things that were struggles and some things that were tough and horrible things that might have happened, but we came out on the other end and we came out with our dynasty. Chaz came out stronger. What happens if you don't? You stay stuck like Howie. You might stay stuck like Mel, and you're still stuck in this time and you didn't ever, I don't want to say improve yourself, but there's a way that we can. So I think that's important for me to get out. And if you love baseball, you're going to love to see Bo versus Dion. If you love baseball, you're going to love to see that Kevin Moss run with the Moss Tops. If you love baseball, you're going to see some great things, but also the human stories involved here, I think are just as important, if not more important, to make the series a little bit different and refresh. It's a fresh look at something that you think you know.
Well, DJ Caruso, director of Bronx Zoo 90, thank you so much for taking the time. This is extremely enjoyable. I can't wait for everyone else to see it as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for your enthusiasm for it too. I really appreciate that.